kind of a one-slide summary from part one of the workshop, then moving into what is mindfulness and what is the connection between mindfulness and post-traumatic stress and mindfulness really for trauma care. A lot of interest in some work has been done about adverse experiences in mindfulness and meditation, and that really sets the stage for why trauma-sensitive mindfulness is really helpful. So we'll delve into that a bit. Have some opportunity for a practice at the end, and of course, I love to provide resources and references before we move into our community connection. And so my brief intro, my name is Kelsey. I've been living with type 1 for 23 years. I just had my diversity about 2 weeks ago, or less than 2 weeks ago. So this is me up here in the corner at my diagnosis time. I lived in Northwest Ohio for most of my life, and then moved to Minnesota for a couple years, and then now I'm currently in Greenville, North Carolina. So I've kind of been Midwest, North, where it's very cold and snowy, and then now here in North Carolina where it's very hot and humid. So a lot of extremes there. And in those different places, I have studied psychology with an emphasis on clinical counseling. Right now I'm studying for my PhD in clinical health psychology here in North Carolina. And there's always been this fascination or interest in the mind-body connection and kind of how can mindfulness-based practices be helpful for our overall health and well-being. And so I share that because some of what I'll share tonight, it's going to be rooted in research and kind of looking at what does the science tell us. But then I also have this hat that I wear where I am a mindfulness and yoga facilitator myself. And so I have had extensive training, particularly with trauma sensitive mindfulness and yoga approaches, but also have a registered yoga teacher training. And so I have that practitioner hat that I wear too, where I'm learning and growing these practices from that lens. And then also, of course, in my personal life, I practice. And so those three kind of ways of knowing and learning are really important and inform how I'll present the information tonight. And then one last piece for my love for mindfulness and kind of interest in this, I was inspired to kind of connect those ideas to type 1 diabetes. And so I wrote a book and self-published it through Amazon this year. Picture of the book is here, and shout out to Veronica Burkott, who is the illustrator who made this really, really amazing diabetes mandala. You can see all the diabetes supplies in there, the juice boxes, pumps with tubes, pumps without tubes, insulin syringes, all the stuff. It's all in there. So I really am grateful for her collaboration in that, and I'm always happy to chat more about the book if you like. And then I had to throw in, here's my dog, here's Leo. I'm in my office right now, so I'm not home with him, but if I were home, he would be right in my lap, probably right in the Zoom call. And so that's a little bit about me. I love to offer for you all, if you want to share anything about yourself in the chat, I will read them when I'm done when the recording is done, so I'll pull it up. But for each of you to kind of learn a little bit more about who's here, where you're Zooming from, perhaps your connection to the diabetes community or the sangha specifically, or really anything else you want to share, also knowing that some of you already have some connection with one another. And so sharing whatever feels useful for you right now, also knowing you don't have to share if you don't want to. Okay, so feel free to use the chat throughout as well. So transitioning into kind of the content for tonight, starting off with a very, very, very general overview of what trauma and post-traumatic stress are or might look like or show up in our world. I went into a lot more detail with this in the first part of the workshop, the recording, so definitely check out the Sangha's YouTube channel if you want a refresher there. So this will be really condensed and concise. I also want to acknowledge that the topics tonight that we'll be talking about are really, really, really huge topics that if you leave with more questions than when we started, that's awesome and that's expected. And this is really just meant to be like a brief intro as a segue for us to maybe have some conversation about some of these larger topics. And so if we were to give perhaps a definition to trauma, often in the medical community or in the mental health field, trauma is defined as an event or set of circumstances in which an individual has their life threatened or perceives that their sense of safety has been threatened. And so some examples, maybe common examples of trauma might be living through a natural disaster, a transportation accident, perhaps experiencing physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, ongoing circumstances of trauma, maybe like long-term abuse, or maybe experiences of racism. So there's like a very broad, those are just some examples of trauma, but trauma can encompass a wide range of events or set of circumstances. And an individual can experience trauma and then have some impacts biologically, socially, and psychologically. So we kind of use this biopsychosocial framework to think about what are the impacts or what are the effects of living through trauma. And so I have a few of those listed here in the green. And so this first line looks at maybe the biological piece. There is evidence that shows that there can be brain changes, or like the neuroanatomy structure of the brain can change after an individual lives through trauma. We see an increase in stress hormones, or maybe there's not that kind of like surge of stress hormones and then kind of coming back to a baseline. It's maybe like overuse of stress hormones or disruption after trauma. And there's also a lot of evidence that shows that there's a pretty direct link between living through exposure to trauma and then having physical health concerns or issues later in life. So that's the biological piece. Again, these are just really brief summaries. This next line is looking at kind of like the social piece. Sometimes it can be really challenging to develop interpersonal relationships after trauma, especially depending on if the trauma was interpersonal in nature, right? There might also be this tendency to want to socially withdraw. It might feel difficult to trust others or to just feel a sense of safety relationally with others after experiencing trauma. So those are some of the main takeaways for social impacts. And then down here, this third line is looking at some of the psychological concerns that might happen after trauma. And I went through this a lot in a lot more detail in the first one, kind of thinking about symptoms or experiences after trauma that might include intrusions. So that might be having thoughts or memories about the trauma coming into your daily life when you're not wanting them to. Maybe having nightmares or reminders of the trauma when you're not in an environment that may be triggering it. Someone might also be struggling with avoidance, and so maybe those internal reminders of trauma they're really scary, and so trying to find ways to avoid those thoughts or feelings or body sensations that might remind someone of the trauma that they experienced. It's also possible individuals might experience a negative change in mood, and so maybe feeling lower mood or difficulty feeling more positive mood changes and kind of feeling like they're kind of stuck in this state of negative mood. Or negative change in cognition, which might mean having a lot of thoughts of self-blame or thoughts that the world isn't safe, these thinking patterns that are hard to kind of come out of. On the last category, there is an increase in arousal or reactivity, which might mean feeling like it's really easy to kind of act out or have these big explosions of maybe rage or harder emotions, and then not being able to kind of come back to baseline. Or also maybe feeling like you're really tense, you have a lot of muscle tension, or you're always on watch, or something that we call hypervigilance, kind of always looking for a threat because you've already survived a threat or a set of circumstances that were threatening. And so those are just some examples. Those are the main ones of psychological symptoms or experiences that might happen after trauma. And these are expected to have some kind of distress after surviving a life-threatening experience. When these experiences stay with an individual for an extended period of time and start to impact them negatively in their day-to-day functioning and cause them a lot of distress, then maybe a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD would make sense in that situation. And so that I wanted to share that because there's kind of like a spectrum, and we can think of like post-traumatic stress on a spectrum. Like we might be experiencing some symptoms, and then sometimes those symptoms kind of go away on their own. And sometimes when they stay with the individual, then maybe a diagnosis of PTSD is warranted. And then the purple here, it shows our statistic that 70% of the world's population experiences at least one trauma, on average about 3 events. And from that statistic, about 5.6 individuals will experience PTSD over their lifetime. So these are kind of global statistics to kind of give a general overview. So trauma itself, really common. And then knowing that individuals might be experiencing stress or post-traumatic stress from their PTSD, kind of like a niche or like a group of individuals who might be struggling with these experiences to an even greater extent. So we start to transition to think about mindfulness, knowing that you all are in the sangha and here, you probably already have your own working definition of mindfulness. And I like to share here that this is, a practice that arrives from Eastern philosophy with roots in Buddhism. And I tend to use John Kabat-Zinn's medical definition of mindfulness. So he is the one who kind of brought mindfulness to the attention of the Western medical community to say like, hey, like maybe mindfulness can be helpful in the context of physical and or mental health conditions. And so that definition here is on the screen. And he defines mindfulness as this paying attention in a particular way, being on purpose, and bringing the qualities of non-judgment, curiosity, and open awareness to the present moment. And so we're using that lens to kind of think about mindfulness as an idea or a construct. There are also like two ways we can think more deeply about mindfulness itself. So when you think about trait mindfulness, which is everyone has a trait mindfulness, like your daily your ability to kind of bring mindfulness to your daily life. So without practicing, this isn't having a sitting meditation or a time in which you are trying to cultivate mindfulness. It's just kind of like already, how well do you bring the qualities of non-judgment, curiosity, or open awareness to your daily life and really living absorbed in the present moment? And then the other way to think about mindfulness can be state mindfulness. And state mindfulness is when we are intentionally practicing a mindfulness meditation, right? Or intentionally bringing ourselves to a place of mindfulness. As that can be following the breath, that could be a movement meditation, it could be anything that falls under the umbrella of practicing. And there's been some really interesting work that shows that there's kind of like this reciprocal relationship between trait and state mindfulness. And so individuals who have higher levels of trait mindfulness, they're more likely to already be going through their day-to-day life in a state of mindful awareness. They are more likely to be able to fall into that state mindfulness, the intentional practice of mindfulness, easier. But then it also works the other way. If someone has kind of low baseline trait mindfulness, like their day-to-day life, their mindful awareness is kind of lower, through repeated intentional practice of mindfulness, of state mindfulness, you can kind of boost up or bring up that trait mindfulness. That's a really interesting piece that I wanted to share, and that'll come back when we start talking a little bit more about trauma. And so the next piece here, there's a pretty cool diagram that's on the screen. This is a free image download. Anyone can download this and use it from the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine. And it's this concept called the window of tolerance, which is something that was created by Dan Siegel. And the window of tolerance is, everyone has a window of tolerance. It's kind of like a place in which you feel like you can manage or cope with whatever's happening in your life. And so you'll still probably feel emotions, you'll probably feel some stress or pressure or whatever the thing is that's happening, but it doesn't overwhelm you. And so the window of tolerance is really kind of like the sweet spot. It's kind of like where we want to be. We want to be in our window of tolerance with whatever life is throwing at us. And then there are going to be times when we get pushed out of the window of tolerance. And so if we'll go up first. So sometimes we get pushed up out of the window of tolerance, and that would be a state called hyperarousal, where those might be bigger emotions like a lot of anger or anxiety or feeling just like your mind or your body are out of control. It's like a huge state of overwhelm. And if you're familiar with the terms fight or flight, kind of like our stress response, like sometimes people feel like they want to fight, or sometimes people feel like they want to run away from a threat or something that seems really stressful. That's the hyperarousal state. And so on the diagram, it's depicted by a volcano. So it's kind of showing like things are erupting, right? It's hard to control and it's a lot of overwhelm. The opposite direction in which we can get pushed out of the window of tolerance would be a place called hypoarousal. So that's down here depicted by the cartoon, looking really like kind of sad or numb or not really having a lot of expression. And so in a state of hypoarousal, and that's where an individual might feel really spacey or zoned out or numb or frozen. And going back to like the fight flight responses, there's also a third one called freeze. And if that's familiar to you, that's kind of the state of hypoarousal. feeling like it's hard to feel anything, it's hard to find motivation to do anything. You just kind of want to shut down and just be. Different than a state of relaxation. A state of relaxation would be within the window of tolerance. Hypoarousal is kind of pushed down, in which there's no energy at all. And between these two places, whether it's hyperarousal or hypoarousal, I really want to reiterate that these are normal human experiences, and we all will be pushed to hyperarousal or hypoarousal, and that's okay, and they're feelings, and it's part of our experience. The challenge becomes when an individual might be stuck in one of those places, right? They may be stuck in a state of hyperarousal in which it's starting to negatively impact them or causing consequences that are adverse. Same thing for hypoarousal, if someone's kind of stuck in that state of freeze or feeling zoned out and it's causing them significant challenges. So if we go back to the window of tolerance, we all have a window, and that window can grow and change. It can grow and it can shrink. And things that impact the window would be things like stress, typical daily stress, or traumatic stress experiences. And so trauma, here on the left side, trauma shrinks the window of tolerance. And what that means is that this yellow zone becomes smaller, which means the hypoarousal and hyperarousal areas become bigger, which means it's easier to get pushed out of that window, and it's easier to get stuck in those states of hypoarousal and possibly have negative consequences for them. It also means that when you get pushed out of the window, it takes more time to get back into the window because those hypo and hyper states are larger and the window is smaller. So by nature, it'll take more time to kind of feel like you're regulated and grounded and coming back to a place of feeling at ease within your window. The good news is that there are ways that we can expand our window of tolerance. And so some ways in which we can kind of help foster the growth of that yellow area could be anything that is a healthy coping strategy for you. And so the context of this infographic, it's really saying, well, if someone goes to evidence-based therapy has been shown to be effective and help widen the window, kind of expand it. There's also some research that shows that mindfulness-based interventions or mindfulness can be a way to kind of expand that window of tolerance. Those are just two examples I'm sharing here, but there are many other ways in which an individual can expand that window. And so this will be helpful. I'll kind of return to this when thinking about how to apply mindfulness in the context of trauma. If we're thinking in the context of trauma, mindfulness could be a way to expand this window, and as a strategy when we get pushed out of the window to come back into it. And so then thinking a little bit more closely about the relationship between mindfulness and post-traumatic stress. Lower trait mindfulness, that's that daily mindfulness that you're bringing to your life, is related to someone having worse trauma symptoms. And so there's been a relationship established there where if trauma symptoms tend to be worse when trait mindfulness is lower. So if we can use practices that help us enhance trait mindfulness, then maybe that might help decrease some of the trauma symptoms. There's also been some interesting work that shows that trait mindfulness, that's your baseline mindfulness, when it's higher, it increases the efficacy or the ability of a trauma therapy to work better. And so that's maybe helpful if someone is struggling with some post-traumatic stress and wants to use kind of like mindfulness as a buffer or kind of a way to like amp up the work that they're already putting into their trauma therapy and see better results. And it's been hypothesized that mindfulness is particularly helpful for some of those post-traumatic stress symptoms I mentioned at the start of to reduce re-experiencing of trauma. So that's kind of like feeling like trauma is happening all over again or having those intrusive thoughts or memories about the trauma. It's also helpful to reduce avoidance of the symptoms. So mindfulness kind of helps us maybe be with whatever is here without perhaps turning away from it. And also particularly the symptoms of numbing, that's kind of like the freeze state, or hyperarousal, which is up here in that kind of feeling a lot of anxiety or out of control or overwhelm. And the way in which this is proposed to work is through a concept called dual awareness. And dual awareness is our ability to say trauma happened in the past and trauma is not happening right now in the present. and I'm experiencing these symptoms, or whatever word you want to put there. I'm experiencing these adverse reactions right here, right now in the present. And so it's the ability to kind of identify with like the event itself is over, and I'm still experiencing something right here in the present that is distressing and deserves to be recognized and validated. Of course, this doesn't work if the trauma is kind of ongoing and truly is a traumatic instance in the current moment. And so that dual awareness is really to be able to say something happened in the past and then how it's impacting you in the present. And then what can you do to kind of bring yourself back into that window of tolerance, so you're not stuck up in these states of hypoarousal. And so there's been some cool work that has looked at how effective mindfulness or mindfulness-based interventions are actually for trauma care. And it's been shown that MBIs or mindfulness-based interventions can be effective as forms of PTSD treatment. So that's exciting. There's also been some work that shows that mindfulness-based interventions might have better retention rates compared to some other approaches for managing PTSD. So maybe like some other trauma therapies. Not to say that one is better than the other. I think it's cool and important to have different options that someone can choose what's going to be most effective for them at different times, different phases of their lives, and different phases of their healing. But ultimately, we really want someone to kind of like finish some sort of healing intervention, right? So if something is started and then it's stopped and it's not finished, they didn't experience the full course of the therapy or the mindfulness intervention, there's most likely not going to see a lot of benefit from that. And so showing that people maybe tend to stay in the mindfulness-based interventions over perhaps some other therapy options is important to note. And then the last piece down here, there's been some work that shows that longer mindfulness practice, so like that state mindfulness, the intentional practice of mindfulness itself, was able to predict reductions in PTSD symptoms. And so it's not saying more is always better, but this study was able to say, well, individuals who continued with mindfulness practice and had that consistent practice were able to kind of help manage those and keep those reductions in the PTSD symptoms. And so, as with everything in life, there are pros and cons, right? And so we've seen a lot of like there's some evidence for mindfulness and helping manage post-traumatic stress. Um, And also, there's the possibility that mindfulness could be harmful or could be hurtful in the context of trauma care. And so this work is a little bit more recent, especially when thinking about effective interventions for any type of health condition, but especially in the context of trauma. Some researchers, Wilby Britton is a big name, who started to think about like, okay, well, we also need to look at what are the possible adverse experiences that could happen in mindfulness. So that way we can fully inform people if they're choosing to use mindfulness and it's part of their healing, or if someone maybe doesn't know that they've experienced trauma, but maybe is starting to practice mindfulness and might be experiencing a lot of distress, to help them kind of understand what might be going on. And so some of this work has shown that individuals who have trauma histories were more likely to experience distress in mindfulness practice. And some reasoning behind that might be because this is really broad, but generally speaking, mindfulness practice asks us to kind of turn toward whatever's happening in our bodies and our minds and our experience in the moment. If someone is struggling with post-traumatic stress symptoms and having those kind of intrusive thoughts or maybe feelings in their body as if trauma is happening again, super um, bringing super attention to that stimuli is actually going to be more harmful than helpful initially in their healing journeys. And so that's what this point here is also saying, that like when that sustained attention is there and individuals don't have other coping strategies or don't have other supports put in place, re-traumatization can actually happen because it's too much too fast, and it pushes an individual out of their window of tolerance. So I mentioned Willoughby Britton. She does a lot of work with adverse experiences in meditation and mindfulness. This is one study of hers where they looked at mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a really popular mindfulness-based intervention. So of the 96 people who participated in that cohort, 83% reported that they had at least one adverse meditation experience. And adverse meditation experience is defined really broadly, right? It can be anything. And again, this is kind of on a spectrum. And so thinking, okay, adverse, something that an individual identified as being adverse during their meditation experience. But then we look at these points further. Then 58% of the individuals said that the adverse experience actually was really negative for them and had a negative valence for them during the practice. 37% of that group said that the adverse experience had a negative impact on their ability to function after the meditation. And then 14% had said that there was a lasting negative effect. So after the meditation had ended, after they had left the mindfulness group, they were still experiencing that negative effect. And a lot of that was related to the window of tolerance, feeling like they were experiencing hyper arousal, so kind of pushed up in that state of a lot of anxiety, agitation, bigger, like kind of explosive emotions, and not being able to come back down to baseline. Or dissociation, which is kind of that hypoarousal state, kind of feeling really numb, spacey, zoned out, and not really feeling like they can get their energy back up to their window. And so based on this awareness, David Treleaven, which I have his book here, definitely recommend it, has coined the term trauma sensitive mindfulness and has started to bring awareness to how can meditation facilitators or practitioners have an awareness of trauma and how it may or may not show up in the meditation itself. And so, this working definition is trauma sensitive mindfulness is that awareness of trauma and how it's impacting the mindfulness practice, and being able to recognize the impacts of trauma. And then being able to, once you recognize that perhaps trauma is causing this adverse reaction in mindfulness or meditation, being able to respond effectively. So being able to make adjustments in your practice, or stop the practice altogether, or bring in other coping strategies, like whatever's going to work for you. So being able to respond effectively. And ultimately, this is to create a space, or to be in a space that aims to prevent re-traumatization to the best of our abilities, knowing that yeah, it's always a work in progress too. So I love this quote. This is directly from the book. And David asks, is mindfulness easing this person's suffering or exacerbating it? And this is really important to think about, because mindfulness can be helpful, right? We saw some of those studies. And it can also be harmful. We saw some of those outcomes as well. And that can change for an individual over time too. It's nothing static, but just having this awareness, because I think sometimes in our daily life, at least I hear a lot about mindfulness as being kind of marketed as something that is like always helpful and always positive. And this is really bringing that kind of like full perspective to, well, perhaps there might be some challenges, or there might be really extreme challenges that could lead to re-traumatization. So just being able to hold that, I think, is important. And then trauma sensitive mindfulness is created to promote the use of mindfulness in this titrated way that allows for safe distress tolerance. And so everything's kind of in balance here. We don't want to promote avoidance of trauma, or avoidance of negative reactions, or avoidance of adverse experiences completely. But we don't want someone to be pushed into an experience in which it's too much too soon, and that really throws them out of their window really easy. So it's all about kind of navigating this balance, or titration, doing a little bit at a time and kind of seeing what works and what doesn't, and making adjustments along the way to fine tune. I like to add in, whenever I'm talking about trauma sensitivity or being trauma informed, that it's not a checklist. So it's not like, okay, if I do A, B, C, then I'm trauma sensitive and trauma informed. It's instead more of like a framework or a lens that we can use to view and understand the world. We can understand ourselves. We can understand the individuals around us whom we know closely, or maybe individuals that we don't know closely, to just have another way of knowing and learning, and then ultimately be able to improve accessibility, keeping in mind that trauma is so pervasive in our world. And then along those lines, it's always an ongoing learning. So even if you read all the books and look at all the research, there's still things that can change over time. And just keeping that sense of kind of curiosity and humility is really important when thinking about trauma sensitive practices. And so with that being said, I have some possible examples of what it might look like to be in a trauma sensitive mindfulness space. And again, this isn't a checklist. I have 16 boxes on here. This is not all the ways. These are just some ways to maybe start to like have some concrete examples of what this looks like or how it might show up in a space. And when I was coming up with this, when I was preparing for this workshop, I was thinking, I was like, okay, well, this is really interesting because, um, who's my audience and who might be watching this video later. And so I want to state that some of these might feel more applicable if you are a mindfulness facilitator and you are guiding meditations, you yourself are kind of leading a group. Um, but then we can also take that same information and think about it for ourselves and as mindfulness practitioners. If you're looking to connect with a mindfulness teacher in your community, or you're doing your own meditations at home that are self-guided, and perhaps might be having some experiences or kind of thinking about um, how to be more trauma sensitive in that context. And then the third thing that I wanted to share was this can also extend beyond the context of mindfulness. Of course, the presentations focus on mindfulness, but we can also use these principles or these ideas in our interactions in daily life outside of the context of mindfulness specifically. And so the purple row, the purple boxes will be things that we can think about or start to do before we are even in a meditation space. And so the first one is education about trauma, which you all are doing because you are here in this workshop. So starting to just learn, like, what is the working definition of trauma? What are the impacts of trauma? I listed a few at the start of this presentation. There are a lot more than that, and it's people dedicate their careers to this, to learn and study about it. Traumas can be pervasive and have profound impacts on an individual's life. So always having this sense of ongoing learning and education about trauma, so you are able to recognize the impacts it might be having in the present moment. The next one, relatedly here, is know your scope. And so this is particularly important if you are guiding meditations and you're a mindfulness teacher yourself. Um, and that is the context in which you're working. You're not expected to work as a mental health professional or a psychologist or do trauma therapy right there on the spot, right? That's not ethical and that's not what you know how to do. Same thing goes for if anyone listening here, or even just to name, if someone is a mental health professional but is not a mind body facilitator, right? Is not a mindfulness teacher. Sometimes mindfulness is integrated into therapy, and so there might be kind of a push to do that, but really then seeking out additional training and certifications if that's something that you want to do. And then kind of the third perspective here I'll offer is for yourself, right? So kind of knowing yourself, if you're noticing like, well, maybe this sounds like I've had trauma or I'm not really sure, these kind of symptoms are happening to me, kind of then knowing whom you're going to talk to about that and kind of what their scope is. So I think that's important to keep in mind too. Along those same lines, then wanting to connect with trauma care providers when necessary, when warranted, when appropriate, and right. So thinking if you are a mindfulness facilitator, it's always kind of useful to have maybe a referral list for the community that you're working in. If something were to come up and an individual wants to tell you a little bit about what's going on with them, right? You don't have to listen to a trauma narrative, right? That's not your role in that situation when you're guiding community meditations. So being able to have a referral list is very helpful. And same goes for mental health providers. If someone's interested in meditation, then maybe seeking out someone who has particular training in trauma-informed mindfulness, and then being able to refer your patient there. And the same thing with yourself, right? If there's something that you want to talk with someone who's trained and works within a specific scope and has a specific skill or expertise you're looking for, always recommended to kind of seek those people out. And then the last one here is having an awareness overall of the social context. And so kind of where are you in the world? Where are you located? And kind of what's the social context in the place in which you exist in the world? And how does that social context maybe create some trauma paradigms or some trauma dynamics? And what identities are maybe at risk of experiencing trauma or harm or abuse in the place in which you live in the world? can also think about that within yourself too. Maybe what identities do you have that may or may not be supported by the social context in which you're living, because that can also be traumatic for individuals. And so the purple is kind of more abstract, kind of like things that we can be thinking about before we are even in a meditation space, or outside of meditation space as well. The green will be things that you can start to think about before you're actually practicing mindfulness, but you're kind of like in the space of the meditation. And so the first one here is safer environments. And so being trauma sensitive means really putting a lot of intention and thought into the physical space or virtual space in which you are practicing or guiding mindfulness. And so one example might be making sure that everyone knows where the exits are. And I'll be talking in kind of like broad themes or examples here, but know that everything will be different for each individual and also based on kind of what their trauma history is. But sometimes people who have experienced trauma want to be close to an exit. They feel safer and more comfortable to be close to the door so they could leave quickly if they needed to. Other contexts or other examples might be an individual prefers not to be near the door, but they want to be able to see the door and face the door and see who's entering and who's exiting the space at all times. So those are just like a couple of examples of perhaps how to just be mindful of like where you are located and then what needs might the participants have that must be met. This is also something for you to be curious about within yourself too, if you're entering mindfulness spaces, or kind of what can help bring you or keep you in your window of tolerance. If you're feeling like you're kind of pushed up and you're feeling really anxious because you're not able to see the door, are you able to maybe reorient yourself so you can? The next one here is thinking about empathy and validation for trauma responses. And so the post-traumatic stress symptoms that I noted at the start of the presentation are protective, right? Those experiences, as distressing as they are protective, and parts of our life that, yes, are distressing and can be helped, and also like served a purpose at the time of the trauma, right? That hypervigilance is because someone doesn't want to experience that level of dread or sense of mistrust or issue in the future. And so just being able to recognize that and maybe bring some compassion, some self-compassion, some compassion to others can be really helpful, instead of maybe working against the trauma responses and seeing them as really, really, really bad all the time, horrible parts that you don't want to acknowledge. So just kind of bringing some balance to that thinking. Next one here in the green is awareness of personal presentation. So you as yourself, how are you showing up in a space? And just being aware of maybe how you interact with others, kind of how your tone of voice, how you're choosing to engage. That goes for if you're leading the meditation, but also you as a participant in the community space, how you're interacting with those around you, because we'll never know what anyone's dealing with in any given moment. And it's just so much easier to be met with like a friendly, welcoming, warm presence than one that's the opposite of that. And so having an awareness of yourself and how you're showing up, and then also knowing that there are things about you that you can't control, that are just elements about who you are that might be triggering for someone and might cause them to kind of be pushed out of their window. And that's just reality, and that's not anything you can change if it's something you can't change about yourself. But just being able to kind of notice that it's maybe not something that is needed to be taken so personally. And the last one in the green is respecting physical boundaries. And so it's really important in physical spaces to ask for consent before touching anyone. I think COVID really changed this for us in like the yoga world. Like hands-on assists aren't really the norm anymore because of what happened with COVID. We had to respect everyone's physical boundaries for a safety precaution. And I think that's a good baseline to always have, right? Asking before you put your hand on someone's shoulder, asking before you give someone a hug, never being forceful or touching at all, because that can be very triggering, especially survivors of interpersonal violence. And so then now we'll move into the pink boxes. And so here's where we'll spend more of our time. These are adjustments or principles that can be added to the meditation or the mindfulness session itself. And then I'll give a few examples for each of them. And so kind of like the essence of what does it mean to have trauma sensitive mindfulness is everything is choice based. So trauma by nature happens without someone asking for it to happen, right? Okay, no one ever asks to be in a traumatic scenario. And so giving someone choice helps to kind of rebuild this sense of autonomy and the sense of empowerment that was taken away in the context of trauma. And I also want to note that choices can be really overwhelming too. And so coming back to that idea of titration, doing maybe a little bit and seeing what works for your group or for you yourself, knowing that if you give someone like 15 choices in a meditation, that's probably going to be really overwhelming. That's probably going to push them out of their window of tolerance. But if you give them maybe 2 choices or maybe eventually up to 3 choices, that might be something that feels safer and then gives someone the opportunity to do what works for them and feel like they're developing that sense of agency or growing that sense of agency. Related to making choices is the use of invitational language. And this is something that I get a lot of feedback on, actually, myself as a facilitator, is like, you need to be more assertive. And I was like, well, the invitational language itself is very intentional. And that's an interesting thing to think about, like how our word choice matters and how it might impact someone. So examples of invitational language would be things like maybe, when you're ready, perhaps, if you'd like, you could, you may, you might. So giving those, so you're allowing people to know that there are choices they can do, and you're not telling them what to do, or you're not commanding or demanding or expecting them to be a certain way. As with everything, there's kind of like 2 sides, and also knowing that sometimes it's helpful for us to just be in spaces where we are told what to do, but still doing that in this kind of invitational, warm, gentle presence is really important. And so if those choices are really overwhelming and someone is feeling like they're really dysregulated and they just need maybe some simple mindfulness instruction, doing that with the sense of genuine warmness is still very effective. Next point here could be allowing for breaks. And so maybe in more traditional mindfulness, it's kind of expected that you complete the whole practice, you have to do the whole thing, but knowing that you don't have to. Like, I'll say that right here, you don't have to finish anything. You don't have to do it. If you decide that it's not working for you and it's pushing you outside of your window, either hyper or hypo aroused, you can always end the practice yourself. You can always leave. You can always do something else. You are in control and you always have that power. The fourth one is providing external anchors. So sometimes mindfulness can be more internally focused. So kind of focusing on what we're thinking, feeling, emotions, body sensations, and that can be helpful. There are also times when maybe that focus is related to a trauma reminder or trauma-related stimuli where that intense focus is actually more dysregulating and pushing someone outside of their window. So giving kind of external anchors, like maybe noticing colors or sights or sounds or smells or anything that's like in your environment around you, can sometimes be helpful for an individual to still practice mindfulness, still practice present moment awareness, but it's external instead of internal. Another possible way to bring trauma sensitive approach to mindfulness could be incorporating movement. And so sometimes it can be really hard to hold still or to stay still for an individual who has survived trauma, if that was what they needed to do to get through the trauma and the time, or if they were kind of held captive or forced or confined to be in a very small space. Being still and not moving for a meditation is actually going to be very dysregulating and it won't be as helpful. And so allowing, and that comes back to the choice-based language and invitational language, just letting people know, like, you can move, or if you want to change the way you're resting, you can do that. Like, there's no set in stone exact way that you need to show up in the space. Check in with yourself and do what works for you. Along those lines, using neutral language is helpful. I've been in some spaces where or not really meditations, but more in like yoga spaces where someone, a facilitator might say like, oh, and it feels really good to take a deep breath here. And I know they mean well by that, but being really hyper attuned to the impact of, well, like, what if it doesn't feel good to take a deep breath today? Or like, what if it doesn't feel positive, or whatever the positive valence is in the sentence? Because individuals, for any of us, and then also in the context of trauma, it's harder to feel positive emotions or feel a sense of positivity. And so if there's kind of this description of like, well, you should be feeling, or doesn't it feel good here? And it doesn't, that can just create a lot of looping thoughts of like, well, I'm not doing it right, or am I something wrong with me? And it's not always very helpful. We also want to create a sense of predictability. And so trauma happens out of nowhere and can make it harder to kind of build a sense of trust and safety in the external world afterwards. So, as a mindfulness facilitator, having a space in which you set up, you say what you'll do, and then you actually do it. You don't have to give everyone all your plans for the practice, but in general, like today we'll do some breath work and then a body scan, and then we'll have time to discuss at the end. And so people kind of know what to expect, and they can choose to stay in or opt out if they want. And the last one here is everything in trauma sensitive mindfulness is person centered. And so acknowledging that even the 16 or the 15 other points here might not be helpful for everyone all the time. So it's really empowering someone to do what works for them at any given moment, knowing that ultimately the individual knows themselves best and they're responsible for themselves. And so the research about trauma sensitive mindfulness specifically is much, much, much less than looking at mindfulness in the context of trauma. There have been some studies that showed a decrease in PTSD symptoms and depression after an 8-week intervention, and then also looked at how feasible and acceptable trauma sensitive approaches are within a community. And so that there were some good outcomes showing that people are interested in this and they would want to use trauma informed principles in a mindfulness based intervention. And there was one other one that I was able to find that looked at trauma sensitive mindfulness and compassion. So it brings in the self compassion piece. And that also found decreases in PTSD and related symptoms. Individuals from that intervention were interviewed a month later, and they were able to self report that they had this newfound sense of empowerment, new relationship to their self, their body, and improved interpersonal relationships. So, kind of seeing the lasting effects of how these principles could impact somebody. So I know I went through a lot of information, so I want to have some just main takeaways from this workshop tonight. So really taking away that trauma is pervasive across the globe, and unhealed trauma can lead to distressing symptoms. Mindfulness has been shown to be a helpful tool in the context of trauma care. And on the flip side, there's also an awareness of adverse experiences that someone might have during mindfulness practice, which warrants a trauma sensitive approach. Using a trauma sensitive approach involves acknowledging the impact of trauma in the here and now, in the present moment, but then providing some adjustments and some ways in which we can be flexible to really promote autonomy, a sense of safety and accessibility when using mindfulness as a form of trauma care. And overall, there's some limited trauma sensitive mindfulness research itself that is showing that these principles are effective, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And so, with that, mindful of our time, we have 10 minutes left in the group, and I want to save space for discussion. And so, I think do a guided practice, maybe about 3 minutes. If it's helpful for you, if you want to tune into the practice, you're welcome to. You're also welcome to maybe use this time to kind of listen into how I guide and maybe connect that to some of the principles or ideas that we just reviewed. And so when you're ready, you're welcome to find a place in which you like to open your practice. So that might mean adjusting the way in which you're sitting in your space, maybe moving to standing or resting on your back. If it's helpful to invite movement into your body, maybe you wiggle your toes or open and close your hands. Kind of anything to move from that thinking part of ourselves and the brain into your body. And if you like, you might start to look around your space. Maybe here you start to notice colors or objects that are nearby. And maybe you start to name them to yourself, maybe out loud or in your mind. If you'd prefer to focus on what you can hear in the space, maybe you take a moment to pause and notice what you're hearing right here, right now. Maybe naming that to yourself out loud or in your mind. And if it feels okay, you might choose to keep your eyes focused on something in your space. Or maybe you're ready to start to lower your gaze or close your eyes all the way. You're welcome to stay here. Or if you like, you might start to check in with how your breath is moving in your body. Maybe noticing how your breath is rising and falling. If you wanted, you could choose to place a hand over your heart or a hand over your belly. And taking one intentional breath here. So maybe one full inhale followed by one full exhale. And then when you are ready, if your eyes had been closed, opening your eyes, maybe looking around your space, shifting around and how you were resting, and eventually checking back in with your screen, kind of tuning your awareness back to our community space, acknowledging that that was really brief 3-minute practice. Okay. And so I have, just like last time, I have a list of resources. These are all particular to trauma sensitive mindfulness themselves. And then my contact information, I'll throw this into the chat. And as always, I like to include the references too, because there's a whole body of work and it's really interesting if you're wanting to learn more or kind of read these in depth. And so with that, I thank you so much for your attention, and I'm going to stop the recording so we can transition to our community time, the little bit of time that I've left for us.